there. I'm Chris-Rachael, your Kitchen Overlord. I am fresh back from South by Southwest, where I had a wonderful time, and some of the good people at the web video panels, which by the way were phenomenal, challenged me to do a video a day for a month. That's kind of intimidating, so I'm going to start off with a video a day for a week on something I know a little bit about, The Hobbit. There happen to be 7 Hobbit meals, 7 days in a week, works out really well, and I know a little bit about them because I wrote The Hobbit Cookbook, which you can pick up on Amazon.com. We're not going to really talk about the cookbook, we're going to talk about some things I wasn't able to get into in there. So today, we're going to start with breakfast. The problem with breakfast is, even in the Shire, it's kind of boring. I mean, we'll get to some interesting stuff in a second, but breakfast is a great excuse to give you an overall context of food at the time that the Shire was based on, which most of you probably think is medieval, unless you're Tolkien scholars or just obsessive fans like me, but it's actually late Victorian, the time of Tolkien himself's childhood. He based the Shire very, very much on a village that his aunt had a farm called Bag End, real place, Bag End, outside of Birmingham, that he absolutely loved, that he just saw their way of life completely disappearing with the encroachment of modernity, and he just wanted to preserve some of that. And if you read anything that he's written, in addition to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, about food, so much of it is inspired by World War I and then later on the interwar period in World War II, when rationing was going on, when there were food shortages. The whole point of having 7 meals a day was specifically because that seemed just as crazy fantastical to people who were reading these books when they were new as dragons. It was just as realistic to them because there just wasn't food around. And so, you know, this man is writing these things out of love and passion and remembrance of his childhood. I find it very inspiring. So, more historical context for this. People at the time spent 2/3 of their income, your average middle-class person, 2/3 of their income just on food. And they didn't have any sort of social security, they didn't have unemployment benefits, most of them didn't have any savings, so if you got sick and couldn't go into work, your family didn't eat. If you were injured at work, you might have nothing but literally bread, and if you're lucky, maybe some milk to go with it for a week. It was very, very close to the bone with things like that, which is why you see so many recipes are very loose, shall we say, with the amount of ingredients. They will say things like, use enough flour, use adequate seasonings. And that's not just because they hadn't standardized things the way that we do today. It's also because the people that they're writing this down for knew perfectly well that if they said, you must use 1 tablespoon of something, or you must use 1 cup of something, the people reading it might not have that. And so cooks were very flexible with how much of anything that they were making and how much they were going to put into things, especially really expensive ingredients like imported spices and meat. So, breakfast. What were people actually eating at the time? Now, when most Americans think of an English breakfast, and for all I know, for many people in other countries as well, you think bacon, eggs, sausage, a big platter of hearty country food. At the period that Tolkien based the Shire on, 1890s, that is in fact what your wealthier farmers would have been eating, but it's not what the elite were eating. And when most of us think of Victorian foods, we're thinking about what the 1% of that era ate, which is some crazy stuff. You have to keep in mind, at that point, the sun still didn't set on the British Empire. They're getting imported foods from all over the world, and they don't know what to do with them. A lot of the craziness of Victorian cooking was just because they had all these ingredients. They had the pineapples, and they had curry, and they had potatoes, and all these things. They had no idea. Like, it's not like they imported cooks from those regions to go with them. So they would just hand this stuff to their cooks who've never seen it, who've never seen the context that it was in, never tried any of the foods that it was based on, and say, figure it out. Which is how we end up with horrible things like kedgeree, which was based loosely on an Indian curry, but is in fact a fish and milk porridge with saffron in it. Yay! Great to be a wealthy Victorian, I guess. Now, the wealthy Victorians also had teams of household servants. If you've seen Downton Abbey, for example, you have an idea just how many people it took to maintain even a small household. Some of those cooks are getting up at literally 3 to 4 a.m. to make basically a buffet, which is not something that we see on Downton Abbey that much, of breakfast foods that were all like these very hot foods that take ages to make. People in the Shire would not be eating like that. For one thing, they didn't have the wealth disparity going on. Tolkien was very clear that the Shire is a very egalitarian sort of society. And for another thing, fuel was very expensive. If you're going to make something in an oven, you're going to have to get that oven hot first. Do you really want to waste your fuel on that, or do you want to use it to keep your family warm? And even if you have literally extra wood or coal to burn, do you want to get up at 3 a.m. for it? Probably not. So most actual country food at that time was something you could boil because you've got a pot on a fire anyway to keep you warm, or something made in a skillet. Now, making things in a skillet was very different than from now, because those of us that can just walk up to an oven and turn it on, whether it's a gas oven or an electric oven, can't really wrap our brains around cooking before that, I feel. Unless you've experienced it or have a good imagination or have read some of the great books out there about history of food, you've got an actual roaring fire. Have you ever tried to cook anything on a fireplace and put a dish in there? That's one of the reasons the handles are so long on these things. So if you wanted to make something in a skillet, what you would basically do is you get a good solid cast iron skillet. You would put it in the fire, let it get hot, pull it out just long enough to put your ingredients in there and shove it back in the fire, then pull it back out again. Now that works fine for something like fried eggs. In fact, you can pull the skillet out, crack your eggs right in there, fry them, get them on a pan, you're good to go. It's the equivalent of fast food for that period. If you've got leftover potatoes from last night, which most people probably did, you can make a great hash. You just grab everything that you have as a leftover that's already pre-cooked anyway, while your skillet is heating up in the fire, dice it all up small, pull that skillet out, slap it down in there, push it down to get it, nice even layer, put it back in the fire, go deal with whatever else you're dealing with, hopefully some coffee or whatever, pull it back out, flip it over, you're good to go. Things along those lines, something that you could touch very briefly, put in the fire, pull back out just as briefly, with your padded mitts and things along those lines, and get on a plate. Not the type of skillet cooking that we think of today when we think of skillet cooking. So the recipes that I've got in there are a mix, honestly, of some of the country food along those lines, slap in a skillet, get in and out very quickly, and some of the wealthier foods that, man, back then would have taken multiple people, tons of resources. The fuel is as important as the cost of food for some of these things. Like, I've got a recipe for poached pears stuffed with fermenty, which is super cheap and easy for someone to make today and would have been 1% elite food back then, because not only are you using expensive ingredients like saffron and heavy cream and whatever for making the porridge, but you've got poached pears. If you've never made them, these days poached pears are super simple. You just pour some booze into, about yay high, into a pot, get it to a nice boil, reduce that to a simmer, peel your pears, scrape out the middle, put them in there until one side softens, flip them over till the other side softens, boom, good to go. You barely have to pay any attention to it. But remember everything I just said about cooking over a roaring fire that can singe your eyebrows off if you get too close to it. Poached pears are really difficult if that's what you've got as an oven. So, and that's what your average country person would have. So again, breakfast, it would either be, if it was a cooked breakfast, like I said, something very quick on a skillet, or something in a pot. Porridge was a staple breakfast for everybody because, and yes, with the old songs like peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in a pot 9 days old, yeah, people would just leave it in there, add a little bit more, let it boil all day. They didn't have like that tenderness and crunch that a lot of people have today with like steel cut oatmeals. It was just mush, not a whole lot of flavor in the mush. It had been boiling for a long time, or simmering, or getting cold and getting reheated, because it's really hard to maintain temperature accurately with things like that. But luckily, as long as you get it back up to a boil, it's probably going to kill any bacteria, which is one of the reasons why so much country food is boiled aggressively. Just again, giving you a little bit of context there. Now, everything I've talked about that's cooked food for your average person that would have lived in the equivalent of the Shire is still fancy day food. They might be making that like on church for Sundays or at a feast day or something like that. What real people were actually eating on a day-to-day basis was just leftovers from last night. Because it's cheap, it's there, yeah, it's been sitting out at room temperature all day. Hopefully you don't die from salmonella, which was a constant problem, people dying of food poisoning anyway. And it was just easy. So a lot of people would eat what they called cold, which we would think of as refrigerated, just meant not cooked, sitting out at room temperature for an indefinite period of time. They also, like I said, would reuse things. So if you made a chicken on Sunday, you've got your roast chicken going, yay, you're not going to eat all of that, no matter how many people are in your family. Everyone's going to get probably 3 or 4 ounces of meat at the most. The rest of it's going to be cold chicken the next day, served with some other things for lunch. And then after that, the bones are going to be put into a stock pot and turned into soup. So you've basically got at least 3 days of meals out of something like that. And they were constantly reusing every last scrap of leftovers. Because like I said earlier, 2/3 of your income are going to food. You don't let anything go to waste. So I hope this has given you a bit of a context for the overall world of Tolkien's food. Tomorrow we're going to go into detail about Second Breakfast, which is fantastical by the standards of what people would actually be eating at the day, but hey, we're gonna give the Shire a little bit of credit here for being a little bit better placed than reality. But I hope you enjoyed getting a little real-world context for exciting, unexpected foods from a very expected source. Since, I mean, if you haven't read The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings right now, seriously, people, go out and buy it. It's wonderful. Talk to you tomorrow.